I walked into my own $12 million penthouse to find my cousin mocking me loudly across a crowded room, asking who let the stray inside while my entire family laughed. I stayed completely silent as the music stopped, and 50 sets of eyes judged my travel-worn suit, waiting for me to break down and leave. Then the building security team came running from the private elevator, but they did not grab me. They grabbed my cousin instead, and the sheer terror on his face was worth every single struggle I had ever endured. I am Zora, 35 years old, and a self-made private equity investor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind entitled family members that you are no longer the punching bag they grew up with, and that cutting off toxic blood is sometimes the only way to build your empire. For the past month, I had been living out of suitcases flying between London and Tokyo to close a massive corporate acquisition. My body was exhausted, my mind was drained, and the only thing keeping me going during the 14-hour flight back to Chicago was the thought of my sanctuary. I had purchased the two-story penthouse in one of the city's most exclusive downtown high-rises entirely in cash 3 years ago. It was my fortress. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, imported Italian marble countertops, and a profound, beautiful silence that I had earned through years of relentless grinding. I swiped my secure fob in the lobby, stepped into the private elevator reserved solely for the penthouse owner, and closed my eyes as the mahogany doors slid shut. I was ready to drop my bags, pour a glass of expensive wine, and sleep for 2 days straight. The elevator chimed softly, signaling my arrival at the top floor. But as the doors parted, my anticipated silence was violently shattered. A wall of sound hit me instantly. A heavy bass line from a DJ booth vibrated through the floorboards. The air, usually scented with the subtle cedar diffusers I imported from France, was thick with the smell of cheap catering food and spilled alcohol. I stepped out of the elevator vestibule and froze in my tracks. My expansive, minimalist living room had been transformed into a garish nightmare of pastel pink and blue balloon arches. Over 50 people were crammed into my home, holding crystal flutes of my vintage champagne, laughing and shouting over the loud music. And standing right in the center of it all, posing for a photographer in front of a massive floral wall, was my estranged family. They were throwing an extravagant baby shower. The guests of honor were my older brother DeAndre and his wife Heather. DeAndre was the undisputed golden child of our family, a man whose arrogance was only matched by his chronic inability to keep a job. Beside him stood Heather, my white sister-in-law, wearing a designer maternity dress and glowing under the attention she constantly demanded. I stood near the entryway, my leather overnight bag hanging heavily from my shoulder, simply taking in the sheer audacity of the scene. I watched catering staff casually set down silver trays of caviar on my pristine white marble island, leaving oily rings on the stone. I saw my Aunt Vivian, the toxic matriarch of our extended family, sitting on my custom velvet sofa, spilling a drop of red wine onto the pale fabric without a single care. They had absolutely no idea I was standing there. They also had absolutely no idea that I owned the building they were standing in. To them, I was just Zora, the rebellious disappointment, who refused to fall in line, the girl they had not spoken to in over a year. Then the illusion broke. My cousin Trey, a slick-talking real estate broker who always wore suits that were one size too small, was walking toward the kitchen when he locked eyes with me. He stopped dead. A nasty, familiar smirk spread across his face, the kind of smile he always wore right before trying to tear me down. He did not ask how I got up there. He did not ask how I was doing. Instead, he raised his voice so the music seemed to drop away, ensuring every single person in the room could hear his performance. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Trey announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "Who let her in? She is like mold. She just keeps coming back no matter how much you scrub. Someone call the front desk and get this stray out of Heather's venue before she ruins the aesthetic." The DJ abruptly cut the music. The lively chatter died instantly, replaced by the suffocating silence of 50 strangers and family members turning to stare at me. I could feel their eyes raking over my wrinkled blazer, my messy travel hair, and my flat shoes. I saw DeAndre stiffen his jaw, clenching as he glared at me from across the room. Aunt Vivian rolled her eyes dramatically and muttered something under her breath to the woman sitting next to her, but it was Heather who reacted the loudest. She pushed her way through the crowd, her hands resting protectively over her pregnant belly, her face twisted into a mask of exaggerated distress. She marched right up to me, her expensive perfume assaulting my senses, and began her usual routine of weaponized victimhood. "What are you doing here, Zora?" Heather demanded, her voice high and tight, intentionally loud enough for her wealthy parents standing nearby to hear. "This is my special day. DeAndre worked so hard to lease this luxury venue for me, and you just have to show up and ruin it with your negative energy. You are not invited. You need to leave right now before you stress me out and harm the baby." I looked at Heather, then shifted my gaze to DeAndre, who had walked up to stand behind his wife. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me with the same arrogant superiority he had worn since we were children. He really had convinced his wife, and likely her entire family, that he was a successful businessman who could afford a $50,000 weekend rental in Chicago's elite district. "You leased this place?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice deadpan and completely devoid of the hysteria they were trying to provoke. "Yes, he did," Heather snapped back before DeAndre could answer. "Because unlike you, your brother actually cares about providing for his family. Now get out." The hypocrisy of her words almost made me laugh out loud. Through her shrill insults, a flood of memories rushed back, reminding me exactly why I had cut these people out of my life. DeAndre had never provided for anyone. He was a black hole of financial ruin enabled by parents who worshipped the ground he walked on. I remembered being 18 years old, holding my college acceptance letter in one hand and my bank statement in the other. I had worked 3 jobs throughout high school to save enough for my freshman tuition. But DeAndre, who was 21 at the time, had racked up a massive gambling debt that threatened to put him in prison. My parents had cornered me in the kitchen, demanding I empty my college fund to save my brother's life. They told me family comes first. They told me I was a strong black woman, and I could easily figure out another way to pay for school, but DeAndre needed a clean slate. When I looked my mother in the eye and said no, she packed my bags in garbage sacks and threw them onto the front porch. I was homeless at 18, forced to take on massive student loans and work night shifts while DeAndre got his debts cleared and received a new car as a reward for his supposed fresh start. They had branded me selfish and disloyal ever since, a narrative they eagerly spun to anyone who would listen. And now, 17 years later, they were standing in my living room, drinking my wine, breathing my air, and ordering me to leave. I did not yell. I did not try to explain that I was the deed holder of this multi-million-dollar property. They had never listened to my words before, so I decided it was time to let my power do the talking. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened a direct message thread with the head of the building's private security team. I typed a single brief sentence, hit send, and slid the phone back into my pocket. "I am not going anywhere," I said, simply crossing my arms and meeting Trey's smug gaze. Trey scoffed, pulling his own phone out. "You always were stubborn and stupid, Zora." "Fine, we will do this the hard way." He dialed a number, putting it on speakerphone for the crowd to hear. "Lobby concierge," he said loudly. "We have an unauthorized trespasser in the penthouse. We need her removed immediately. Use force if you have to. She is harassing a pregnant woman." He hung up and smirked at me, crossing his arms in a perfect mirror of my own posture. "You are about to be humiliated in front of all these important people, Zora. You brought this on yourself." I did not move a muscle. The tension in the room was suffocating. Heather began to fake cry, leaning into DeAndre's chest, while her mother rubbed her shoulders, throwing venomous glares in my direction. The guests whispered furiously, pointing at me, clearly viewing me as the bitter, jealous sister trying to ruin a beautiful family moment. I let them whisper. I let them marinate in their false sense of superiority. Less than 2 minutes later, the private elevator chimed again. The heavy mahogany doors slid open, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. 6 large building security guards stepped out, their expressions grim and professional. Trailing right behind them were 2 uniformed Chicago police officers. Trey's face lit up with triumph. He stepped forward, gesturing dramatically toward me. Finally, Trey said, pointing his finger right at my face, "Officers, this is the woman. Grab her and drag her out. She is trespassing and refusing to leave a private event." The head of security, a tall, broad-shouldered man who had worked for the building for 5 years, stepped past Trey without even looking at him. He walked straight up to me, stopping at a respectful distance. He gave a slight nod, his posture deferential. "Ma'am," the head of security said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the dead-silent room. "I apologize for the intrusion. We received your message. Are these the individuals you need removed from your residence?" Trey's hand dropped slowly to his side. His mouth parted in confusion. DeAndre stepped back, his eyes darting between me and the security team, the color completely drained from Heather's face. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. I looked at the head of security, then let my eyes drift over the shocked, horrified faces of my family members. I looked at the extravagant decorations, the spilled wine, and the forged lease agreement sticking out of DeAndre's suit pocket. I felt a cold, calm certainty wash over me. The years of being the scapegoat, the years of silent suffering, all ended right here on my imported marble floors. I turned my attention back to the security chief and gestured broadly toward Trey, DeAndre, Heather, and my Aunt Vivian. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and echoing with absolute authority. "None of these people are authorized to be in my home. Clear them out, every last one of them." The head of security did not hesitate. He gave a sharp nod and signaled his team. The 6 large guards and 2 uniformed police officers instantly spread out across my living room. They moved with practiced efficiency, politely but firmly instructing the catering staff to pack up their equipment and ordering the guests to locate their coats. The immediate aftermath was pure chaos, and I stood perfectly still watching the absolute destruction of my family's fabricated reality. Trey tried to argue. He puffed out his chest and stepped aggressively toward the head of security, shouting that he was a licensed real estate broker and that this was a massive misunderstanding. One of the police officers simply rested a hand on his utility belt and advised Trey to step toward the elevator before the situation escalated to an arrest. Trey swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating instantly, and scuttled toward the doors like a frightened child. Heather, realizing that her grand social event was actually being shut down, threw a spectacular tantrum. She began to sob hysterically, clutching her stomach and collapsing against DeAndre. She wailed that the stress was going to put her into early labor, loudly complaining to her wealthy parents that I was a monster who hated her simply because she was white and married to the love of my life. Her mother wrapped a pashmina around her shaking shoulders, throwing venomous glares in my direction as they were herded toward the exit. DeAndre was furious. His face was a dark storm of rage and humiliation. He demanded to speak to the building manager, shouting that he had spent $50,000 on this venue and that he was going to sue the entire property management company into the ground. The security guards simply ignored him, forming a physical barricade that forced my furious family and their bewildered guests out of my penthouse and into the elevators. I followed them down. I wanted to make absolutely certain they left the premises. The ride down to the ground floor was agonizingly tense. We were packed into the glass-walled elevator, the silence only broken by Heather's dramatic sniffles and Aunt Vivian's heavy, angry breathing. When the doors finally slid open to the grand marble-floored lobby, the true extent of their humiliation became apparent. The lobby was bustling with other wealthy residents returning from their weekend outings. Men in tailored suits and women carrying designer bags stopped and stared as 50 people in formal wear were effectively marched out of the building by law enforcement. The murmurs and whispers echoed off the high ceilings. My family, who had spent their entire lives obsessing over appearances and social standing, were being paraded like common trespassers. It was too much for Aunt Vivian. The toxic matriarch of our family could not handle the public embarrassment. As we reached the revolving doors, she suddenly spun around, her eyes blazing with irrational fury. Before I could even register her movement, she lunged at me. Her heavy hand struck the side of my face with a sharp, stinging slap that echoed through the quiet lobby. My head snapped to the side. The security guards immediately lunged forward, grabbing Aunt Vivian by the arms and pulling her back. But I raised my hand, signaling them to stop. I did not touch my cheek. I just slowly turned my head back to look at her, my expression completely blank. "You miserable, jealous little girl!" Aunt Vivian screamed, her voice cracking with rage as she struggled against the guards. "You just could not stand to see your brother happy, could you? You have always been bitter. You have always been a dark cloud over this family. You purposely waited until Heather's parents were here to pull this stunt just to embarrass us. You are a disgrace to your bloodline." I stared at her, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with disgust. "You broke into my home," I said, keeping my voice low and dangerously calm. "You drank my wine. You disrespected my space. And now you are upset because the world gets to see exactly who you people really are." Before Aunt Vivian could spit out another insult, DeAndre stepped aggressively between us. He shoved his hands into his tailored jacket and pulled out a sharply folded document, practically throwing it into my chest. I caught it before it hit the floor. "You do not own anything, Zora," DeAndre snarled, his voice echoing in the lobby. "I do not know whose bed you had to jump into to get those security guards to listen to you, but I have a legally binding lease. My holding company paid top dollar for that penthouse through Trey's luxury brokerage. I have the paperwork right here. You are nothing but a disgruntled squatter who hacked the building directory, and I am going to sue you for everything you have." I slowly unfolded the document. It was a standard, generic commercial lease agreement, the kind anyone could download off the internet for free. I scanned the terms. It stated that DeAndre's company had leased the penthouse for a flat rate of $50,000 for the weekend. But it was the bottom of the page that caught my complete attention. On the line reserved for the property owner's signature, there was a sloppy, barely legible scrawl. It was signed under the name of a fake LLC. But I knew Trey's handwriting. I had spent years doing his homework for him in high school. The loop on the capital letters, the heavy pressure on the pen, it was undeniably Trey's handwriting. He had forged a lease to steal $50,000 of his own cousin's corporate funds, giving DeAndre fake access to a property he never had the right to rent out. I looked up from the paper. Trey was standing near the revolving doors, looking incredibly pale and refusing to make eye contact with me. I looked back at DeAndre, who was standing tall, looking incredibly smug, truly believing this piece of paper was his ultimate trump card. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my own pocket. "DeAndre," I said softly, almost gently, "are you absolutely certain you want to stand by this document? Because submitting a forged lease across state lines, using corporate funds to finance a personal party, and presenting a fraudulent contract to law enforcement are all federal offenses." DeAndre laughed. It was a loud, harsh sound filled with arrogance. He looked at Heather's parents, making sure they were watching him take control of the situation. "You are completely insane, Zora," he mocked, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I am not playing your little games anymore. You want to talk about the law? Let us talk about the law." He unlocked his screen and immediately dialed his attorney, putting the call on speakerphone for maximum dramatic effect. When the lawyer answered, DeAndre immediately launched into a fabricated story claiming I was violently harassing his pregnant wife and illegally evicting him from a property he had rented for his company. He ordered his lawyer to file an emergency injunction against me first thing Monday morning. He demanded that my bank accounts be frozen and that I be legally barred from entering the penthouse. "I will see you in handcuffs by Monday morning, Zora." DeAndre sneered as he ended the call. "Enjoy sleeping on the streets because that is exactly where you belong." He turned his back on me, wrapping a protective arm around Heather, and led his entourage out through the revolving glass doors and into the cold Chicago night. Aunt Vivian gave me one last look of absolute pure hatred before following them. Trey scurried out behind them, looking terrified but relieved to be escaping the immediate confrontation. I stood alone in the grand lobby, the security guards standing quietly at a respectful distance. The sting on my cheek had faded, replaced by a deep, warming sense of anticipation. DeAndre thought he had won. He thought his aggressive tactics and loud voice had secured his victory, just like they always had when we were children. He thought he had successfully painted me into a corner. What my arrogant brother did not know was that my phone had been recording audio ever since I stepped off the elevator. It was resting safely in my coat pocket, actively saving a high-definition voice memo of the entire encounter. I had his voice clearly stating that he used his corporate holding company to pay for a personal baby shower. I had his clear admission of presenting a forged legal document. And I had the physical lease itself with Trey's fraudulent signature sitting right in my hand. They wanted a war. They wanted to drag me through the mud to protect their fragile fake empire. I looked out the glass doors, watching their expensive rented luxury cars pull away from the curb. I smiled, feeling the weight of the forged lease in my pocket. I was not just going to fight their war, I was going to financially obliterate them. By Monday morning, the fallout was already in full swing. I arrived at my corporate office on the 42nd floor of the Chicago Financial District, stepping out of the elevator into a quiet, sleek lobby overlooking the city. I had spent the entire weekend consulting with my legal team, quietly preparing my counteroffensive. I knew DeAndre was arrogant, but I severely underestimated just how far he and Heather were willing to go to protect their fabricated image. Julian, my chief financial officer and one of my most trusted friends, knocked gently on the glass door of my office before stepping inside. His expression was grim. He held a tablet in one hand and a stack of legal notices in the other. Without a word, he set the paperwork on my desk. The emergency injunction DeAndre had threatened in the lobby was not an idle boast. His attorney had somehow found a sympathetic judge on a Sunday afternoon and presented a completely fabricated story of assault and unlawful eviction. As a result, my personal checking accounts had been temporarily frozen pending a full hearing. But the frozen accounts were not what had Julian looking so concerned. He slid the tablet across my desk and told me I needed to see what was happening online. I pressed play on the screen. It was a video of Heather. She was sitting in her pristine, softly lit living room, wearing an oversized beige sweater that perfectly emphasized her pregnancy. Her makeup was done to look intentionally messy, as if she had been crying for hours, and she was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She wept hysterically into the camera, pausing to catch her breath and clutch her stomach. The video already had hundreds of thousands of views and was spreading like wildfire across social media. In the video, Heather painted a horrifying picture of a deranged, angry black sister-in-law who was obsessed with ruining her mixed-race family out of pure spite. She claimed that I had crashed her beautiful baby shower unprovoked and hired fake police officers to physically drag her out of a venue her husband had legally rented for her. She cried about the trauma to her unborn child, sobbing that she no longer felt safe in her own city because of my unhinged jealousy. I scrolled through the comments. They were absolutely brutal. Thousands of strangers were calling me a monster, demanding that my employer fire me, and tagging the local police department, asking for my immediate arrest. Heather was weaponizing her tears, perfectly leveraging every societal bias she could to play the ultimate victim. She was destroying my public reputation simply because I had refused to let her occupy my home. Before I could even hand the tablet back to Julian, the heavy glass doors of my corporate suite swung open violently. DeAndre and Trey strolled right into my private office, completely ignoring my receptionist who was frantically trying to block their path. DeAndre was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored suit, looking like a man who had just conquered the entire world. Trey trailed right behind him, his confidence completely restored now that he was safely away from the real police. I waved my receptionist off, signaling that it was fine and she could close the door. I wanted to hear exactly what these two had to say. DeAndre walked over and sat down in the leather chair opposite my desk, crossing his legs casually as if he owned the building. He tossed a thick manila folder onto my desk, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet room. He smiled, but it was a cold, predatory look that made my stomach turn. He leaned forward and told me that he was a reasonable man. He said he did not want to see his own flesh and blood go to federal prison or lose her career over a viral internet scandal. He offered me what he called a gracious settlement. If I signed the documents inside that folder, he would call off his attack. He would have his lawyer drop the injunction, unfreeze my accounts, and have Heather film a retraction video claiming it was all just a big misunderstanding fueled by pregnancy hormones. The catch was incredibly simple. I just had to sign over my remaining 40% ownership of our late grandfather's holding company. By doing so, I would be giving DeAndre total uncontested control of the family's legacy and its assets. I looked at the thick folder, then slowly raised my eyes to meet DeAndre's gaze. I asked him why he was doing this. Why he always felt the need to destroy everything I built rather than simply working to build something of his own. DeAndre scoffed, his eyes gleaming with pure malice. He told me it was because I never learned my place. He reminded me of the time I bought my very first car, a beat-up used sedan I had saved for 2 years working double shifts to afford. I was 19. He had taken the keys from my purse without asking, crashed the car into a street lamp after a party, and then stumbled home to tell our parents that I had been driving drunk and he was just trying to cover for me. They believed him immediately. They grounded me, took away my savings, and sold the scrap metal to pay for his weekend trips. He smiled brightly as he recounted the memory, telling me that absolutely nothing had changed since we were kids. He said society, the courts, and our parents would always believe the successful family man and his terrified, weeping, pregnant wife over a bitter, solitary, aggressive woman like me. I was trapped, he said, and it was time for me to finally surrender and pay my dues to the family. I looked down at my hands resting on the desk. I forced my breathing to become shallow. I thought about the years of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the financial manipulation, and the sheer audacity of them invading my home. I focused all of that emotion into my eyes, and I let a single genuine tear slip down my cheek. It was exactly what DeAndre wanted to see. He thrived on my pain. He believed he had finally broken my spirit. He pushed an expensive gold pen across the desk toward me. I picked it up with a deliberately trembling hand. I opened the manila folder, flipped to the signature page, and signed my name on the transfer documents. I signed away the very last piece of our grandfather's estate to my arrogant brother. Trey let out a loud whoop of victory, practically jumping in the air and slapping DeAndre on the shoulder. DeAndre snatched the folder back so quickly he almost tore the paper. He stood up with a triumphant, sickening smirk on his face. He looked down at me and told me I had finally made the right choice. He advised me to stay away from his wife and his family forever, turned on his heel and strutted out of my office with Trey eagerly following his lead. The moment the heavy glass door clicked shut behind them, my posture instantly changed. The trembling in my hand vanished. I reached up and calmly wiped the tear from my cheek, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. Julian stepped out from the corner of the office, where he had been quietly observing the entire exchange. He walked over to my desk, looking down at the space where the folder had just been. I looked up at my chief financial officer and asked him to confirm the legal reality of what had just happened. I asked if the transfer was officially binding the moment DeAndre took physical possession of those signed papers. Julian nodded, a wide grin forming on his face. He confirmed that DeAndre was now the sole owner of the holding company, bearing 100% of the legal and financial responsibility for its operations. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long, deeply satisfying breath. What DeAndre and Trey did not know, what they had been far too arrogant and lazy to research, was the actual current financial state of that holding company. Our grandfather had been a brilliant man, but his final commercial investments before he passed away had been completely disastrous. The holding company did not have any assets left. It did not have secret bank accounts or valuable real estate. Instead, the company was saddled with exactly $8 million in toxic defaulted debt. By bullying me, blackmailing me, and aggressively forcing me into signing that transfer agreement, DeAndre had not stolen my inheritance. He had just eagerly accepted full legal and financial liability for an $8 million black hole. And tomorrow night, at the highly publicized charity gala Heather was hosting to impress her wealthy friends, the creditors were coming to collect everything he had. 48 hours after DeAndre proudly strutted out of my office with the signed transfer papers, Heather hosted her highly anticipated charity gala. The event was held in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel, a venue that required a minimum deposit of $75,000 just to reserve the space. It was the centerpiece of her social climbing strategy. She had invited Chicago's elite, including city council members, real estate developers, and several high-profile venture capitalists. Her stated goal for the evening was to raise funds for an urban development initiative aimed at building community centers in underserved neighborhoods. But her actual goal was entirely different. She and DeAndre were using the gala to secure a $2 million corporate loan from Sterling Republic Bank, using my grandfather's holding company, which they now legally owned, as collateral. They needed that cash injection immediately to fund their lavish lifestyle and keep Trey's sinking real estate brokerage afloat. Julian, my chief financial officer, had spent the previous 2 days digging through the public records of Heather's supposed charity. What he found was exactly what I had suspected. The charity was a hollow shell corporation. There were no community centers being built. Every single dollar raised was being funneled through a series of ghost accounts directly into Trey's business to cover up his massive operational losses. They were running a sophisticated fraud ring, and tonight they were planning to rob the city's wealthiest investors blind. I arrived at the Palmer House just as the cocktail hour was transitioning into the main dinner service. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green evening gown that commanded attention the moment I walked through the revolving brass doors. But my best accessory for the evening was my date. I was walking arm in arm with Donovan Sterling, the senior loan underwriter for Sterling Republic Bank. He was the exact man Heather and DeAndre had been aggressively wooing all month. He was the man holding the $2 million checkbook. When we reached the entrance of the grand ballroom, I saw the security team Heather had hired. She had explicitly given them a printed photograph of my face, labeling me as a hostile, emotionally unstable family member who was absolutely banned from entering the premises. The lead guard stepped forward, holding up a hand to stop me, his eyes darting down to his clipboard. "I am sorry, ma'am," the guard said strictly. "You are not on the approved guest list for this evening. I am going to have to ask you to leave the floor immediately." Donovan smoothly stepped in front of me, adjusting his silk tie. He looked at the guard with the calm, intimidating authority of a man who managed billions of dollars in assets. "She is not a guest," Donovan said firmly. "She is my +1 for the evening. If she leaves, I leave, and I will be sure to let the hosts know exactly why their primary investor walked out the door." The guard paled, looking back at his clipboard, clearly recognizing Donovan's name as the VIP of the night. He quickly unhooked the velvet rope and stepped aside, apologizing profusely for the misunderstanding. We walked into the ballroom, and the sheer extravagance of the event was nauseating. There were massive ice sculptures carved into the shapes of doves, towering floral arrangements of imported white roses on every table, and a 10-piece jazz band playing softly on the main stage. DeAndre was holding court near the bar, smoking a cigar and laughing loudly with a group of older businessmen. He was actively boasting about his new acquisition, bragging about how he had just taken full control of his family's historic holding company and was ready to modernize its portfolio. It did not take long for Heather to spot me. She was standing near the grand staircase wearing a stunning silver gown that perfectly accentuated her pregnancy, posing for a society photographer. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, the fake radiant smile vanished from her face. Her jaw dropped. She immediately abandoned the photographer and practically sprinted across the ballroom toward us, her face flushed with absolute panic and fury. DeAndre noticed his wife rushing across the room and turned to follow her gaze. When he saw me standing next to the bank's senior underwriter, the cigar nearly slipped from his fingers. He hastily excused himself from his group and hurried over, arriving just as Heather stepped directly into my path. "What are you doing here, Zora?" Heather hissed. keeping her voice low so the nearby guests would not hear, though her eyes were wild with rage. "Security was supposed to keep you out. You are stalking us. You are completely unhinged, and I am calling the police right now." Before I could say a word, Aunt Vivian materialized from the crowd. She had been sipping a martini near the champagne tower, but the moment she sensed a conflict, she gravitated toward it like a moth to a flame. She stepped up beside DeAndre, glaring at me with the same toxic hatred she had displayed in my lobby. "You just cannot stand to see us shine," Aunt Vivian sneered, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You lost your little corporate war, Zora. DeAndre owns the company now. You have absolutely nothing left to threaten us with. Get out of this charity event before you embarrass yourself even further." I smiled a slow, relaxed expression that only seemed to infuriate them more. "I am not here to threaten anyone, Aunt Vivian," I said calmly. "I am simply here to enjoy the evening with Donovan. We were just discussing the fascinating financial structure of Heather's new charity." Donovan offered a polite, completely unreadable smile to DeAndre. "It is quite an aggressive growth strategy you have presented, Mr. DeAndre. I was just reviewing the collateral files for your loan application this afternoon." DeAndre forced a confident laugh, though a bead of sweat had formed on his forehead. "Yes. Well, as you know, Donovan, the holding company is a rock-solid asset. My grandfather built a strong foundation, and under my sole leadership we are ready to expand. Zora here used to be a minority shareholder, but we recently bought her out due to some fundamental disagreements on ethics." It was a bold, disgusting lie told right to my face, but I did not interrupt him. Instead, I gave a subtle nod to the far corner of the room. Julian, who had slipped in through the service entrance 10 minutes earlier, was standing inside the audio-visual control booth. He saw my signal. Suddenly, the jazz band's microphones cut out with a sharp burst of static. The massive digital screens flanking the main stage, which had been displaying a looping slideshow of happy, smiling children, suddenly went completely black. A murmur of confusion rippled through the ballroom as the guests turned their attention to the stage. A moment later, the screens flickered back to life. But they were no longer showing children. They were displaying high-resolution images of financial audits, bank transfer logs, and wire routing numbers. In the center of the screen was a massive, undeniable flow chart. It showed every single donation that had been made to Heather's charity over the past 6 months, mapping exactly how those funds were being instantly diverted into the corporate accounts of Trey's real estate brokerage. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked gasps and furious whispers. Investors were pulling out their reading glasses, squinting at the screens, realizing they were looking at undeniable proof of federal wire fraud and embezzlement. Heather let out a sharp, terrified gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. DeAndre lunged toward the stage, screaming at the AV technicians to cut the power to the screens, his voice cracking in absolute panic. But Julian had already locked the booth doors from the inside. Aunt Vivian looked completely bewildered, staring at the numbers on the screen and then back at her son Trey, who had just dropped his drink onto the carpet, his face completely devoid of color. The wealthy society friends Heather had spent months kissing up to were now actively backing away from her, realizing they had just written massive checks to a criminal enterprise. I turned my attention back to DeAndre, who had rushed back to our circle, desperately trying to do damage control. He grabbed Donovan's arm, his eyes wide and frantic. "Donovan, listen to me," DeAndre pleaded, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "This is a setup. This is a malicious cyber attack by my sister. She is a disgruntled former employee trying to ruin my reputation. You have my loan application. You have the holding company as collateral. You know my assets are good." Donovan slowly pulled his arm out of DeAndre's grip. He looked at my brother with a mixture of professional disgust and absolute pity. "I did review your collateral files this afternoon." DeAndre Donovan said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear clearly. "And I received an emergency notification from the Federal Treasury exactly 1 hour ago. That holding company you so proudly took sole ownership of has $8 million in toxic defaulted commercial debt attached to it. DeAndre froze. His eyes rolled back and forth as he tried to process the words. He looked at me, his jaw trembling. The creditors have officially called in the debt. Donovan continued, delivering the final crushing blow. Since you signed the transfer papers assuming full uncontested liability for the company, the bank has initiated asset seizure. Your accounts are frozen. Your assets are seized, your loan application is denied. Mr. DeAndre, as of 1 hour ago, you are officially bankrupt. The word bankrupt echoed through the Palmer House ballroom like a gunshot. DeAndre stared at Donovan Sterling, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. The expensive imported cigar slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the carpet and sending up a small plume of gray smoke before a waiter rushed over to stamp it out. The entire room of wealthy investors, city council members, and real estate developers began backing away from my brother and his wife as if they had suddenly caught a contagious disease. Heather was the first to completely break down. She grabbed the sides of her shimmering silver maternity gown and let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She lunged toward Donovan, tears streaming down her face, begging him to reconsider, claiming that there had to be a mistake with the bank's system. But Donovan simply adjusted his jacket, offered a brief nod of professional detachment, and stepped away from her grasping hands. He turned to the crowd, loudly advising anyone who had written a check to the charity that evening to contact their financial institutions immediately and place a freeze on their accounts. That was the final nail in the coffin. The exodus was immediate. Chicago's elite did not walk to the exits, they practically ran. They abandoned their half-empty champagne glasses and plates of caviar, whispering furiously into their phones as they called their wealth managers. Aunt Vivian stood frozen near the ice sculpture, her face pale and her eyes darting frantically around the emptying room. Trey was nowhere to be seen. The moment the audit hit the screens, my slick-talking cousin had slipped out the service doors, abandoning his family to face the music alone. DeAndre finally snapped out of his shock. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He turned his sights on me, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He took a threatening step forward, but Julian, my chief financial officer, had already emerged from the control booth and stepped smoothly to my side, crossing his arms and staring DeAndre down. I did not gloat. I did not need to. The total destruction of their social and financial empire was speaking entirely for itself. I simply looked at my brother, gave him a polite nod, and walked out of the ballroom with Donovan and Julian right beside me. But as I stepped out into the crisp Chicago night air, I knew the war was not entirely over. You can strip an arrogant man of his wealth and his public standing, but a cornered rat is always at its most dangerous. DeAndre and Heather were desperate. They knew the federal authorities would be knocking on their door by morning to investigate the wire fraud I had just publicly exposed. They needed to destroy the physical evidence, and I knew exactly where they would go to find it. I declined Julian's offer to escort me back to my penthouse. Instead, I had my driver take me straight back to my corporate office in the financial district. I rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor, stepped into my dark suite, and dismissed the night security guard. I walked into my private office, left the lights off, and sat down in my leather chair. I swiveled around to face the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights twinkle below, and waited. It took them exactly 3 hours. At 2 in the morning, the heavy glass doors of my corporate suite rattled. I heard the sharp click of the electronic lock being forced open. Trey had somehow managed to steal a master keycard from the building's management office, proving that even in his cowardice, he was still a functional criminal. Footsteps echoed in the dark lobby. I heard the frantic, heavy breathing of 3 people moving quickly through the space. They did not bother turning on the lights, terrified of drawing attention from the street below. I sat perfectly still in the shadows of my office as my door was thrown open. "Find the physical ledgers," DeAndre hissed, his voice echoing in the dark. "Trey, get on her computer and wipe the hard drives." Heather grabbed the files in the cabinets. "We have to destroy the audit trails before the feds get a warrant tomorrow. If we burn the source documents, they cannot prove the charity money went into Trey's accounts. I listened to them tear through my office. File cabinets were yanked open, folders were thrown onto the floor. I heard the frantic clicking of Trey trying to bypass the encryption on my desktop computer. They were acting like common thieves, stripping away the last remaining shreds of their wealthy, privileged facade. After 2 minutes of watching them frantically destroy my workspace, I reached out and pressed a small button under my desk. The heavy LED lights of my office snapped on instantly, flooding the room in blinding clinical white light. Trey shrieked and dropped a stack of hard drives onto the floor. Heather froze, her hands full of manila folders, her eyes wide with absolute terror. DeAndre whipped around, his face pale, staring at me as I sat calmly behind my desk. "What are you doing here?" DeAndre demanded, his voice shaking as he tried to recover his aggressive posture. "I am sitting in my own office, DeAndre," I replied smoothly. "The better question is why my bankrupt brother, my fraudulent cousin, and my thieving sister-in-law are breaking into a private equity firm at 2 a.m. Heather dropped the folders. Her sweet, victimized facade completely vanished, replaced by sheer, venomous hatred. She let out a guttural scream and lunged across the room toward my desk. She slammed her hands down onto the wood, leaning in so close I could smell the stale champagne on her breath. "You ruined my life!" Heather screamed, spit flying from her lips. "You ruined my baby's future. You set us up. We are going to lose everything because you could not just let us be happy." I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I looked her dead in the eye. "You ruined your own life, Heather," I said quietly. "You built a life on stolen money and entitlement, and now the foundation has collapsed." DeAndre stepped up beside his wife, grabbing her shoulder to pull her back. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the room. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the same forged lease agreement he had waved in my face at the Penthouse. He slammed it down onto my desk, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "I am going to sue you into oblivion, Zora." DeAndre threatened, his voice laced with absolute desperation. "I am still holding this lease. I will tell the judge you violently evicted us to cause emotional distress. I will say the audit you showed tonight was fabricated. You are going to sign a public retraction right now, or I swear to God, I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in a courtroom." He was clinging to a piece of forged paper like a man drowning in the ocean, holding onto a single straw. He truly believed he could still bully his way out of this. He promised to have me arrested. He promised to destroy my career. He stood there demanding compliance, just like he had done since we were children. I looked at the forged lease on my desk. Then I looked up at DeAndre, and I finally let myself laugh. It was not a bitter laugh. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated relief. "You are holding a forged document, breaking and entering into a corporate office, and attempting to extort a federal witness." I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. DeAndre sneered. "Federal witness. You are delusional, Zora. Nobody is going to believe you over me." I did not respond to him. Instead, I pressed a second button on my desk console. The automated blinds covering the glass wall of the adjoining conference room slowly rolled up. The lights in the conference room flickered on. Standing on the other side of the glass holding audio recording equipment and watching the entire scene unfold were 2 armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, standing right next to Donovan Sterling, and a federal prosecutor. The color completely drained from DeAndre's face. The forged lease slipped from his fingers. Heather let out a quiet, terrified whimper and collapsed to her knees on the floor. Trey bolted for the door, but he did not make it 2 steps before the heavy glass doors of my office swung open and 3 more federal agents rushed inside. I stood up from my desk, smoothing out my evening gown. I looked at my brother, who was now being slammed against the wall and placed in handcuffs. "I did not just buy the Penthouse, DeAndre," I said, walking slowly around my desk to stand in front of him. "My firm bought the bank that held your business loans. I bought the brokerage firm Trey works for. I own every single piece of financial earth you walk on, And that fake lease you just slammed on my desk, that was the final piece of physical evidence the prosecutor needed to prove your wire fraud syndicate. DeAndre stared at me, his eyes wide, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of his defeat. He had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin, no more parents to hide behind, and no more money to steal. The golden child had finally met his match. I took the crisp paper from DeAndre's hand, my fingers brushing against the heavy, expensive bond paper he had clearly chosen to make his lie feel more official. The lobby was completely silent save for the quiet hum of the revolving doors and the muffled sniffling coming from Heather, who was still burying her face in her mother's shoulder to maintain her performance. I unfolded the document slowly, feeling the intense weight of my family's collective glare burning into me. It was a standard commercial lease agreement, the exact kind of generic template you could download from any legal website for $50. I scanned the meticulously typed paragraphs. The document stated that DeAndre's corporate holding company had leased the Penthouse property for a flat rate of $50,000 for the weekend, supposedly facilitated through the luxury real estate brokerage where my cousin Trey worked. It was a bold, arrogant move. DeAndre was trying to use his corporate status to intimidate me, assuming I would back down the moment official paperwork was introduced into the argument. But then my eyes drifted to the bottom of the page, settling on the line reserved for the property owner's signature. There was a signature there scrawled in thick blue ink on behalf of a fake limited liability company. It was sloppy, written with a heavy hand, but the underlying penmanship was entirely familiar to me. The exaggerated loop on the capital letters, the sharp, aggressive cross on the T, it was completely undeniable. I had spent 4 years of high school doing Trey's English and history assignments just to keep Aunt Vivian from screaming at me about not supporting the family. I knew Trey's handwriting better than I knew my own. My slick, fast-talking cousin had actually forged the landlord's signature himself to secure a $50,000 payout from DeAndre's company. I looked up from the forged lease. Trey was standing near the edge of our group, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, refusing to make eye contact with me. I looked back at DeAndre. He was standing incredibly tall, his chest puffed out, a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He truly believed this piece of paper was his ultimate trump card. He had absolutely no idea that I was the sole legal owner of the building, and I had no intention of telling him just yet. I wanted him to dig his grave as deep as he possibly could. DeAndre, I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and entirely conversational. I want to be absolutely clear about what you are showing me right now. You are stating for the record that you used your corporate holding company funds to pay for a personal baby shower. DeAndre let out a harsh, condescending laugh. It echoed loudly off the marble walls of the lobby. I am the Chief Executive Officer Zora, he declared proudly, looking around to make sure the security guards and Heather's wealthy parents were listening. I can allocate my company's capital however I see fit to provide a luxury experience for my pregnant wife. It is called being a provider, something a bitter, solitary woman like you knows absolutely nothing about. I gave a slow, measured nod, absorbing his confession. And you are certain you want to present this specific document to the authorities? I asked, tapping the blue ink signature with my index finger. Because presenting a forged legal contract to law enforcement and submitting fraudulent corporate expenses are both federal offenses. The smirk vanished from DeAndre's face, replaced immediately by a dark, simmering rage. He hated being challenged, but more than anything, he hated being challenged by me. You are completely delusional, he snapped, snatching the paper back from my hands with such force he nearly tore the bottom corner. You think you can intimidate me with fake legal jargon? You are nothing, Zora. You do not own anything. You hacked a building directory to pull a petty, jealous prank, and now you are going to pay for it. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his phone. I am done playing games with you, DeAndre announced. He unlocked his screen, dialed a number, and aggressively tapped the speakerphone button, holding the phone up for our entire family to hear. The phone rang twice before a deep, professional voice answered. Richard speaking. Richard, it is. "DeAndre, my brother," said his voice instantly shifting from pure rage to a tone of distressed, righteous indignation. "I have an emergency situation. My unstable sister has tracked us down and is violently harassing my pregnant wife at a private venue I leased for my company. She has hired fake security to illegally evict us, and she is causing Heather severe emotional distress." Aunt Vivian nodded in fervent agreement, wrapping a protective arm around DeAndre's shoulder. Heather let out a perfectly timed dramatic sob for the phone microphone to pick up. "I understand, DeAndre," the lawyer replied smoothly, clearly accustomed to my brother's dramatics. "Are you and your wife in a safe location right now?" "We are in the lobby," DeAndre said, glaring daggers at me. "But she is still threatening us. I want an emergency injunction filed against her first thing Monday morning. I want a restraining order. I want her bank accounts frozen for damages, and I want her legally barred from stepping foot near this property or my family ever again." "Consider it done," the lawyer assured him. "I will contact the judge on call this weekend and push the paperwork through. Do not engage with her any further, DeAndre. Just leave the premises and keep Heather safe. We will serve her the papers by tomorrow afternoon." DeAndre ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. The full weight of his arrogance was on display. He had effectively weaponized the legal system against me with a single phone call, wrapping himself in the protective shield of his wealth and his supposed victimhood. "I will see you in handcuffs," Zora DeAndre promised, his voice dropping to a low, vicious whisper. "Enjoy your little power trip tonight, because by tomorrow you are going to be bankrupt and sleeping on the streets exactly where you belong." He turned his back on me, wrapping his arm around Heather's waist, and led his entourage out through the revolving glass doors. Aunt Vivian gave me one final look of absolute pure disgust before following them out into the cold Chicago night. Trey scurried out right behind her, visibly relieved to be escaping the building, before the real police arrived to ask questions about his fraudulent paperwork. I stood completely still in the center of the grand lobby, watching their expensive rented luxury vehicles pull away from the curb one by one. The building's security guards remained standing at a respectful distance, waiting for my orders. The sting of Aunt Vivian's slap had completely faded from my cheek. The threat of DeAndre's high-priced lawyer did not make my heart beat even a fraction faster. Instead, a deep, profound sense of calm washed over me. I reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat and pulled out my smartphone. I looked at the screen. The voice memo application was still open, the red recording timer steadily ticking past the 15-minute mark. It had been actively recording since the moment I stepped out of the elevator into the penthouse. I pressed the stop button and immediately tapped the playback icon. The audio was crystal clear. It had captured the music, Trey's initial insults, Heather's screaming, and Aunt Vivian's slap. But most importantly, it had perfectly captured DeAndre's voice, loud and arrogant, confirming that he used his corporate holding company to pay for a personal party. It captured his threat to use a forged lease agreement, and it captured his entire fabricated, slanderous conversation with his attorney. DeAndre thought he had brilliantly trapped me in a legal corner. He thought he was the ultimate chess player in our family dynamic. He was completely unaware that he had just handed me the exact audio evidence I needed to dismantle his entire life. I locked my phone, slid it back into my pocket, and smiled. Monday morning arrived with a cold Chicago rain beating against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I woke up feeling rested, having spent Sunday organizing my files and preparing the financial trap I was about to spring on my brother. I walked into my kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and opened my laptop to check my personal bank accounts. I expected to see my usual balances. Instead, a bright red banner flashed across the top of my banking portal. My personal checking and savings accounts had been completely frozen. I set my coffee mug down on the marble island. DeAndre had actually done it. He had not just been blowing smoke in the lobby. I picked up my phone and immediately dialed my private wealth manager. He sounded incredibly apologetic, explaining that the bank had received an emergency court order at 8 o'clock that morning. Over the weekend, DeAndre and his high-priced attorney had filed an ex parte emergency injunction against me. They had gone to a judge who was on call for the weekend, presenting the forged commercial lease agreement that Trey had signed. Because Trey was a licensed real estate broker, he had used his official credentials to legitimize the document, providing a sworn affidavit stating that his brokerage had facilitated the rental. They painted a completely fabricated, highly compelling picture for the judge. They claimed I was a disgruntled, estranged family member who had somehow hacked the building's digital directory to masquerade as the owner. They told the judge I was a dangerous squatter who had violently interrupted a private family event, causing severe emotional distress to a pregnant woman. Because it was presented as an emergency domestic and civil dispute, the judge granted a temporary freeze on my personal liquid assets pending a full evidentiary hearing. DeAndre thought he was starving me out. He thought that by freezing my personal checking accounts, I would not be able to hire a lawyer or pay for my daily expenses, forcing me to come crawling back to the family for mercy. He was entirely unaware that my personal accounts were just a drop in the bucket compared to my corporate holdings, which remained completely untouched behind layers of private equity shielding. But the sheer audacity of his legal maneuver told me everything I needed to know about how far they were willing to go. I took a hot shower dressed in a sharp-tailored navy blue power suit and had my private driver take me to my corporate office in the financial district. I walked into my suite feeling completely prepared to dismantle their legal threats. But as I stepped through the glass doors, the atmosphere in my office was incredibly tense. Julian, my chief financial officer and closest confidant, was pacing in front of my receptionist's desk. He looked up when I walked in, his expression tight with concern. He did not hand me financial reports or legal briefs. Instead, he handed me his digital tablet. He told me I needed to see what was happening online before I did anything else. I pressed play on the screen, and my stomach instantly twisted into a knot. It was a video of Heather. She was sitting on the plush white sofa of her meticulously decorated living room. She was wearing an oversized soft beige sweater that perfectly accentuated her pregnancy. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her makeup was expertly applied to make her look exhausted, fragile, and utterly terrified. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. The video had been posted late Sunday night, and it already had nearly 2 million views. It was spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. In the video, Heather looked directly into the camera, her voice trembling as she wiped away perfectly timed tears. She introduced herself and told her audience that she was filming this because she feared for her life and the life of her unborn child. She then launched into a deeply manipulative, highly calculated narrative. She painted a horrifying picture of me, describing me as the unstable, angry, and deeply jealous black sister-in-law who had made it her life's mission to destroy her beautiful mixed-race family. She claimed that I had crashed her private baby shower entirely unprovoked. She told her millions of viewers that I was violently screaming, throwing things, and demanding that she leave the premises because I hated that my brother had married a white woman. She sobbed heavily, clutching her stomach, describing how I had hired fake security guards to physically drag her and her elderly mother out of a venue her husband had worked so hard to rent for her. It was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood. Heather knew exactly what she was doing. She was leveraging every single dangerous societal trope available to her. She played the delicate, terrified damsel in distress, carefully framing me as the aggressive, irrational, and dangerous black woman. She used buzzwords like trauma, unhinged, and unsafe, effectively activating an army of internet strangers to rush to her defense. I scrolled down to read the comment section, and the level of vitriol was staggering. Thousands of people were tearing me apart. They were calling me a monster. They were tagging the Chicago Police Department, demanding my immediate arrest. Internet sleuths were actively trying to dox me, posting the address of my corporate office and urging people to call my employer and demand I be fired immediately. They had no idea I owned the firm. But the most painful part was not the strangers on the internet. It was my own family's participation in the smear campaign. Right at the top of the comment section was a verified reply from my Aunt Vivian. She wrote a long, dramatic paragraph validating everything Heather had said. Aunt Vivian claimed that as my blood relative, it broke her heart to admit it, but I had always been deeply troubled and violently jealous of DeAndre's success. She thanked Heather for being brave enough to speak out and begged the public to pray for their family's safety. Trey had also chimed in, sharing the video to his own real estate business page, claiming he was stepping away from his brokerage duties for the week to help protect his cousin from a domestic threat. They were executing a coordinated public assassination of my character. DeAndre had attacked my finances through the court, while Heather attacked my reputation through the court of public opinion. They were trying to break me psychologically. They wanted me to feel so isolated, so universally hated, and so financially desperate that I would surrender without a fight. I handed the tablet back to Julian. He looked at me, waiting for my reaction. He asked if I wanted him to draft a public relations statement or have our corporate legal team issue immediate cease and desist letters to the social media platforms. I shook my head. A public denial would only fuel the fire. It would look defensive, playing right into the angry black woman narrative Heather had so carefully constructed for me. If I lashed out, I would give them exactly what they wanted. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window of my office and looked out over the city. The rain was coming down harder now, obscuring the skyline. I felt a cold, calculated calm settle over me. The betrayal stung, of course it did. Seeing my own aunt publicly brand me as a dangerous monster was a painful reminder of why I had walked away from them in the first place. But I was not a helpless 19-year-old girl anymore. I was a 35-year-old venture capitalist who specialized in hostile takeovers. Heather's viral video and DeAndre's fake injunction were not victories. They were massive documented liabilities. Every single lie they told the internet, every false statement they submitted to a judge, and every fraudulent signature they filed was just adding zeros to the damages I was going to collect. They were building a massive, highly visible glass house, and they had absolutely no idea that I was holding the wrecking ball. I turned back to Julian and told him to let their fake sympathy, let them think they had completely backed me into a corner. Because I knew my brother better than anyone else in the world. DeAndre could never just win quietly. He had to gloat. He had to stand over his defeated opponent and demand total submission. I walked over to my desk and sat down in my leather chair. I told Julian to alert the building security downstairs to lift the access restrictions for the day. DeAndre and Trey were going to come to my office. They were going to walk through those doors believing I was broke and universally hated. They were going to offer me a way out of the nightmare they had just created, and I was going to let them walk right into the deadliest financial trap of their entire lives. Exactly 20 minutes after I gave the order to building security, the heavy frosted glass doors of my private suite flew open. The sharp thud of the door hitting the rubber stopper echoed through the quiet reception area. My receptionist, a sharp young woman named Chloe, immediately stood up from her desk, her voice raised in professional alarm as she tried to physically block the two men barging into the space. DeAndre completely ignored her. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal gray designer suit that I knew for a fact he could not afford, flanked by Trey, who was practically buzzing with nervous, chaotic energy. They marched past the reception desk as if they owned the entire 42nd floor. Chloe reached for the emergency security button on her phone console, her eyes wide with panic as she looked through the glass walls of my office to make eye contact with me. I raised my hand, giving her a calm, reassuring nod. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and told Chloe it was perfectly fine and that she could hold all my calls for the next half hour. I wanted my brother and my cousin to feel completely uninhibited. I wanted them to perform their arrogance without any interruptions. DeAndre did not bother knocking. He pushed open the door to my private office and strolled in his leather shoes, sinking into the plush carpet. He stopped in the center of the room, taking a slow, exaggerated look around at the mahogany bookshelves, the modern art on the walls, and the sweeping, panoramic view of the Chicago skyline behind my desk. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head with a mocking smile. He walked right up to my desk and sat down in one of the leather guest chairs without being invited. He crossed one leg over the other, adjusting his expensive silk tie. Trey remained standing near the door, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly trying to act as the intimidating muscle of the operation. It was a laughable attempt considering Trey jumped at his own shadow, but the dynamic they were trying to establish was crystal clear. They were here to break me. DeAndre reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the center of my desk with a heavy, dramatic thud. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together and resting them on his knee. He looked at me with an expression of deep manufactured pity. "You look tired, Zora," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You look like a woman who has had a very rough couple of days. Have you checked your bank accounts this morning?" I imagine that was quite a shock. And the internet, well, people can be incredibly cruel when they see someone attacking a helpless pregnant woman. I kept my face completely devoid of emotion. I rested my forearms on the desk and looked at the manila folder, then back up to my brother. I asked him what he wanted. DeAndre sighed, rubbing his chin as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He told me that despite everything I had done, despite the embarrassment I had caused the family at the Penthouse, he was still a forgiving man. He said Aunt Vivian had begged him to show me mercy. He claimed that he did not want to see his own flesh and blood go to federal prison for hacking the building directory, and he certainly did not want to see my career ruined by the viral video Heather had posted. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on my desk. He said he was prepared to offer me a gracious settlement, a complete reset. He told me that if I cooperated, he would call his attorney right now and have the emergency injunction lifted. My personal accounts would be unfrozen by the end of the business day. He promised that Heather would immediately post a retraction video blaming her emotional outburst on severe pregnancy hormones and entirely clearing my name in the public eye. All the legal threats, the public humiliation, and the family isolation would vanish in an instant. I looked at him, letting a heavy silence fill the room. I asked him what the price of this supposed mercy was. DeAndre tapped his index finger against the manila folder. "The price is simple, Zora," he said smoothly. "You need to officially recognize who the head of this family is. You have always been stubborn. You have always tried to outshine me to prove that you are better than the rest of us. But you are not. You are just a bitter woman who got lucky with a few investments." He opened the folder and spun the document around so it faced me. It was a legally binding transfer of ownership contract. Grandfather left us both shares in the family holding company. DeAndre continued, his voice hardening into a direct command. "I own 60%. You own 40%. But you have never respected the legacy. You have never contributed to the family's standing in this city. I am expanding my operations. I need full uncontested control of the holding company to secure the corporate loans I require for my new ventures. You are going to sign over your remaining 40% shares to me right here, right now." I stared at the paperwork. The absolute sheer entitlement of his demand was staggering. He had frozen my personal checking accounts and weaponized social media to destroy my reputation, all to extort me out of my final piece of our grandfather's estate. He truly believed he was brilliant. He thought he had executed a flawless corporate checkmate. Trey chimed in from the doorway, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to sound authoritative. "You better sign it, Zora. DeAndre is giving you a golden ticket out of this mess. If you do not sign, we are going back to the judge tomorrow to make the freeze permanent. And Heather has interviews lined up with 3 different local news stations. Your career in private equity will be completely over by Friday. No one will ever do business with you again." I looked back at DeAndre. He was smiling again, a wide, predatory grin that showed all his teeth. He reached into his pocket, pulled out an expensive gold pen, and rolled it across the mahogany surface of my desk until it hit the edge of the transfer document. He told me to stop fighting. He said it was time for me to finally accept my place in the family hierarchy and let the real businessman take over the legacy. He sat back entirely confident that he had backed me into an inescapable corner, waiting for me to surrender everything I had left. I watched the gold pen roll across the polished mahogany surface of my desk until it gently bumped against the edge of the transfer document. DeAndre leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with an air of absolute supreme confidence. He was completely enjoying this. For him, acquiring the remaining shares of the family holding company was not just a business transaction. It was about putting me back in what he believed was my rightful place. You know, Zora, DeAndre said, his voice dropping into a soft, mockingly gentle tone. I almost feel bad for you. You really thought you could win this time. You thought because you wear expensive suits and sit in a fancy office that you somehow outgrew the natural order of things. But you cannot fight reality. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory gleam. Let me remind you of how the world actually works. Do you remember your first car? My jaw tightened instinctively. Of course I remembered. I was 19 years old. I had spent 2 grueling years working double shifts at a local diner, saving every single dollar in a shoebox under my bed just to buy a used, beat-up sedan. It represented my freedom. It was my only way to get to my college classes without relying on the family that constantly belittled me. DeAndre smiled clearly, seeing the recognition in my eyes. I was 22, he continued, his voice dripping with nostalgia. I had a party to get to across town and you refused to lend me your keys. So I waited until you went to sleep, took them out of your purse, and drove myself. He paused, letting the memory hang in the air. He had gotten completely intoxicated at that party. On his way home, he lost control of my car and wrapped it around a steel utility pole, completely totaling the vehicle. He had walked away without a single scratch, abandoned the wreckage, and quietly slipped back into our house. When the police knocked on our front door the next morning to report the abandoned vehicle, DeAndre was already standing in the kitchen next to our mother. I remember walking downstairs confused and terrified, only to hear my brother spinning a flawless, tearful lie. He looked the officers dead in the eye and swore that I had been the one driving. He claimed I had come home drunk, thrown the keys at his chest, and begged him to cover for me. My mother did not even ask for my side of the story. She did not listen to my frantic denials. She immediately apologized to the police, handed them my insurance information, and blamed it on my rebellious nature. Later that afternoon, she marched me down to the bank, forced me to withdraw my remaining college savings, and gave it to the city to pay for the property damage DeAndre had caused. As I stood in the kitchen sobbing over my lost future, DeAndre had stood in the hallway behind our mother, giving me the exact same triumphant smirk he was wearing right now in my office. You see, Zora, DeAndre whispered, leaning closer to the desk. The truth does not matter. It never has. The only thing that matters is who the world wants to believe. And the world, the judges, the police, the internet, they will always believe the successful family man protecting his terrified, weeping pregnant wife over a bitter, angry, solitary woman who attacks her own blood. You are the villain in this story. You always have been. Trey shifted his weight near the door, emboldened by DeAndre's speech. He is right, Zora, Trey sneered. You saw the comments on Heather's video. The internet has already made up its mind about you. By Friday, you will be completely unemployable. If you do not sign that paper, DeAndre is going to take this to trial. You will lose your career, your money, and your freedom. Sign the paper and we make it all go away. I looked down at the heavy bond paper of the transfer document. I looked at the gold pen resting beside it. I needed to sell this performance perfectly. If DeAndre suspected for a single second that I was not completely broken, his paranoia might kick in, and he might actually read the fine print of the company he was so desperately trying to steal. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my shoulders slump forward, physically shrinking myself in the large leather chair. I thought about the sheer suffocating injustice of my childhood. I thought about the smear campaign Heather had launched, weaponizing dangerous stereotypes against me for millions of strangers to see. I channeled every ounce of that genuine pain and frustration, letting it pool in my eyes until a single heavy tear slipped down my cheek and splashed onto the mahogany desk. DeAndre let out a soft, highly satisfied breath. He fed on my defeat. He thrived on my submission. I picked up the gold pen with a deliberately trembling hand. Without saying a word, I uncapped it and pressed the nib to the paper. I signed my name on the bottom line, effectively transferring my entire 40% stake and complete control of our grandfather's holding company over to my brother. I flipped to the second page and initialed the liability clauses, cementing the legal binding of the document. I set the pen down and pushed the folder back across the desk. Trey let out a loud, obnoxious whoop of victory, pumping his fist in the air. DeAndre snatched the folder off the desk so quickly he nearly knocked over his own coffee cup. He stood up, buttoning his tailored jacket with one hand while clutching the contract tightly in the other. His chest was puffed out, his eyes shining with absolute greed. "Good girl, Zora," DeAndre mocked, looking down at me as if I were a defeated dog. "I will have my attorney call the judge this afternoon and drop the injunction. Your accounts will be unfrozen by tomorrow. But let me make one thing perfectly clear. If you ever come near my wife, my child, or my company ever again, I will not be this merciful." He turned on his heel and strode out of my office holding the folder like a championship trophy. Trey eagerly scurried out right behind him, throwing me one last look of pathetic superiority before pulling the heavy glass doors shut. The sharp click of the latch echoed in the quiet room. The moment the door was sealed, my posture changed instantly. The trembling in my hands vanished. I sat up straight, rolled my shoulders back, and calmly reached for a tissue to wipe the single tear from my cheek. A slow, deeply genuine smile spread across my face. The side door of my private office, which led to a small adjoining conference room, quietly opened. Julian, my chief financial officer, stepped out. He had been standing in the shadows the entire time, listening to every word of the exchange. He walked over to my desk, looking at the empty space where the folder had just been. "Is it officially done?" Julian asked, his voice low, but laced with undeniable excitement. I nodded, leaning back in my leather chair. "It is done, Julian." He took physical possession of the signed transfer, and he agreed to the liability terms on tape. He is now the 100% sole owner of the legacy. Julian let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He actually took it. He did not ask for a single financial disclosure. He did not ask for a ledger, a balance sheet, or a tax return. He just blindly demanded ownership because his ego could not handle you having a piece of the pie. "That is the beauty of arrogance, Julian," I said softly, turning my chair to look out the window at the sprawling Chicago skyline. "It blinds you to the absolute reality of your situation." DeAndre thought he had just executed a flawless corporate takeover. He thought he had bullied me into surrendering a multi-million-dollar empire that he could use as collateral to fund his lavish lifestyle and cover up Trey's real estate fraud. But what DeAndre, Trey, and my Aunt Vivian had completely failed to research was the current reality of our grandfather's estate. My grandfather had been a brilliant man in his prime, but in the final years of his life, his cognitive decline led him to make several massive, highly disastrous commercial real estate bets. He had leveraged the holding company to the absolute breaking point. There were no secret bank accounts. There were no hidden luxury properties. The holding company did not have a single liquid asset left to its name. Instead, the company was heavily anchored to exactly $8 million in toxic defaulted commercial debt. The banks had been circling for months, preparing to seize assets and declare bankruptcy on the entity. I had been quietly using my own private equity firm's lawyers to stall the creditors, trying to find a way to quietly dismantle the debt without ruining the family name. But DeAndre did not want me involved. He wanted to be the sole king of the castle. And by aggressively forcing me to sign that transfer agreement, by extorting me with a viral smear campaign and a forged legal document, DeAndre had not stolen my wealth. He had just eagerly, legally, and permanently accepted full personal liability for an $8 million financial black hole. Tomorrow night, Heather was hosting her elite charity gala. She was planning to use the holding company as collateral to secure a $2 million loan from Sterling Republic Bank. She was going to parade her wealthy friends around completely unaware that the ground beneath her feet had already collapsed. Because tomorrow night, the creditors were not just coming for the company, they were coming for DeAndre. Friday evening arrived with a crisp chill in the Chicago air, setting the perfect stage for Heather's highly anticipated charity gala. For the past 24 hours, Julian and my legal team had been working silently in the background, ensuring that the state's Department of Commerce officially registered DeAndre as the sole owner and primary liability holder of our grandfather's holding company. The moment the digital ink dried on the public registry, Julian made a single anonymous phone call to the chief collections officer at Sterling Republic Bank. He informed them that the holding company, which had been dodging their collection notices for months, had just undergone a massive change in ownership. The trap was fully armed, and Heather had absolutely no idea she was about to host her own financial funeral. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my penthouse, smoothing out the fabric of a custom-tailored deep emerald green evening gown. I paired it with minimal gold jewelry and a sharp, elegant updo. I was not dressing for a family reunion. I was dressing for a hostile corporate execution. Heather had chosen the grand ballroom of the historic Drake Hotel for her event. It was a venue that required a minimum deposit of $50,000 just to walk through the doors, a sum DeAndre had undoubtedly scraped together, using the last remaining shreds of his personal credit, banking his entire future on tonight's success. Heather's stated goal for the evening was to raise funds for an urban youth development initiative, a charity she had supposedly founded to give back to the city. But Julian's forensic accounting had already revealed the truth. The charity was nothing more than a hollow shell corporation. There were no community centers being built and no youth programs being funded. Every single dollar raised from the city's wealthy elite was designed to be funneled through a series of ghost accounts directly into Trey's failing real estate brokerage to cover up his massive operational losses and DeAndre's gambling debts. They were running a highly sophisticated wire fraud ring masquerading as high society philanthropy. More importantly, Heather and DeAndre were using this gala to secure a massive $2 million corporate loan from local investors. They had aggressively wooed the senior loan underwriter from Sterling Republic Bank, promising him that the newly acquired family holding company would serve as rock-solid collateral for the cash injection. They needed that loan to keep their entire fabricated lifestyle from collapsing. Because Heather knew I was still in the city, she had let her paranoia completely take over. Through my connections in the local event planning industry, I learned exactly how far my sister-in-law had gone to ensure her triumph remained uninterrupted. She had deliberately banned me from the guest list, which was to be expected. But she did not stop there. Heather had hired a private armed security firm to supplement the hotel's existing staff. She had personally printed dozens of color photographs of my face, distributing them to every single guard, bartender, and valet attendant working the event. She had labeled me as a hostile, emotionally unstable, and potentially violent estranged family member. She instructed the security team to use physical force to remove me if I even stepped foot onto the hotel property, threatening to fire the security company if they let the angry black sister-in-law ruin her flawless aesthetic. She was terrified that the woman she had spent the entire week destroying on the internet would somehow show up to ruin her victory lap. I slid into the back of my hired town car and watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows as we drove toward the Gold Coast neighborhood. I felt a profound sense of calm. Heather's extreme security measures were based on the assumption that I would show up to scream, cause a scene, and act exactly like the unhinged caricature she had painted me to be. She expected me to fight my way through the front door with sheer anger. She severely underestimated how real power operates. My town car pulled up to the glittering entrance of the Drake Hotel. A line of luxury vehicles was already wrapped around the block, dropping off city council members, real estate moguls, and wealthy socialites dressed in their finest formal wear. I did not get out immediately. I sat in the plush leather seat and waited. 5 minutes later, A sleek black sedan pulled up directly behind my vehicle. A tall, distinguished older gentleman with silver hair stepped out, adjusting his tailored tuxedo. It was Donovan Sterling, the senior loan underwriter for Sterling Republic Bank, and the exact man Heather and DeAndre were banking their entire future on tonight. Donovan was not just a banker. He was a close personal mentor of mine. My private equity firm managed a significant portion of his bank's high-yield investment portfolio. When I had called him earlier that afternoon and explained the massive fraud my brother was attempting to pull on his institution, Donovan had been absolutely furious. He despised being played for a fool, and he despised criminals attempting to steal from his bank. We had formulated a very simple, highly effective plan to expose them. I stepped out of my town car and walked over to Donovan. He offered a warm, respectful smile and extended his arm for me to take. He looked at my emerald gown and nodded in approval, noting that I looked perfectly prepared to close a deal. We walked together up the red-carpeted steps of the hotel, bypassing the line of guests waiting for the coat check. The grand entrance to the ballroom was flanked by massive floral arrangements of imported white roses and 4 large, heavily muscled private security guards in dark suits. They were scanning the crowd with intense scrutiny, holding clipboards and aggressively checking names. As Donovan and I approached the velvet rope, the lead security guard's eyes snapped toward me. He immediately stiffened, his hand dropping to the radio on his belt. I watched his eyes dart from my face to the printed photograph clipped to the back of his guest list. He stepped forward, physically blocking the entrance with his broad shoulders, his expression hardening into a look of absolute authority. "I am sorry, ma'am," the guard said. His voice loud and strict, clearly intended to draw attention and intimidate me. "You are absolutely not permitted inside this venue. You are on the restricted list. I need you to step away from the doors and leave the property immediately, or I will have you escorted out by law enforcement." A few nearby guests turned their heads, whispering and pointing, likely recognizing me from Heather's viral smear campaign. This was exactly the kind of public humiliation Heather had paid for. She wanted me to be turned away at the door like a common criminal. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with the guard. I simply turned my head slightly and looked at Donovan. Donovan's expression turned to ice. He smoothly stepped in front of me, placing himself directly between me and the security guard. He did not yell, but his voice carried the crushing, undeniable weight of a man who controlled billions of dollars in assets. "There seems to be a massive misunderstanding here," Donovan said firmly, looking the guard dead in the eye. "This woman is not an uninvited guest. She is my personal +1 for the evening. I am Donovan Sterling, the primary financial sponsor for tonight's charity. Now you have 2 choices. You can unhook that velvet rope and let us walk inside to enjoy our evening. Or you can deny my partner entry, in which case I will turn around, take my $2 million corporate checkbook with me, and personally inform your employers exactly why their entire event collapsed before dinner was even served." The security guard froze. The color completely drained from his face. He looked at the guest list, saw Donovan Sterling highlighted at the very top as the undisputed VIP of the night, and realized he was trapped. He could follow Heather's paranoid orders, or he could ruin the entire financial purpose of the gala. He slowly unhooked the velvet rope and took a large step back, apologizing profusely for the misunderstanding. Donovan offered me his arm once again, and together we walked straight past the security blockade and into the glittering, extravagant ballroom. The trap was set, the doors were open, and it was time to let my family see exactly who they had gone to war with. The heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom closed softly behind Donovan and me, instantly immersing us in a world of fabricated luxury. The Drake Hotel had truly outdone itself. The vaulted ceilings were painted with intricate frescoes illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers that cast a warm golden glow over the room. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A 10-piece jazz band played a smooth, upbeat melody from the main stage, providing the perfect soundtrack for Chicago's financial elite to mingle and discuss their investments. It was a spectacular display of stolen wealth. Every single flower arrangement, every bottle of imported wine, and every hour of that jazz band's time was being paid for by the toxic debt DeAndre had so eagerly absorbed from our grandfather's estate, supplemented by the fraudulent funds Trey was siphoning from the charity's shell accounts. I scanned the room and quickly spotted the architects of this massive illusion. DeAndre was standing near a towering ice sculpture holding a glass of expensive scotch. He was surrounded by a group of prominent real estate developers laughing loudly and patting men on the back, playing the role of the visionary corporate leader to absolute perfection. A few yards away, Heather was holding court near the grand staircase. She was wearing a shimmering silver maternity gown that caught the light with every movement. She was speaking with two city council members, resting her hand delicately on her pregnant belly, smiling radiantly as she likely fed them complete lies about her dedication to urban youth development. Donovan offered me a polite, knowing glance. He adjusted his suit jacket, highly amused by the sheer audacity of the people we were about to completely dismantle. We began to walk slowly across the patterned carpet, moving directly toward the center of the ballroom. It took exactly 60 seconds for the illusion to shatter. Heather happened to turn her head to accept a fresh glass of water from a passing waiter. Her eyes swept across the room and locked directly onto mine. The radiant, practiced smile vanished from her face so quickly it was almost comical. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and genuinely horrified. She dropped her crystal glass. It hit the marble border of the dance floor, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces with a loud, piercing crash. The jazz band faltered, a few musicians missing their notes as they turned to look at the commotion. The conversations around Heather abruptly stopped. Heather did not miss a single beat. She immediately activated her weaponized victim routine, elevating it to a level I had never seen before. She let out a loud theatrical scream, backing away from me and clutching her stomach as if she had just been physically struck. "She is here!" Heather shrieked, her voice carrying over the music and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Somebody help me, please! She is stalking me!" She broke in. The entire ballroom fell completely silent, save for the sudden frantic whispers of the wealthy guests. Two large security guards from the interior perimeter immediately rushed forward, their hands reaching for their radios. But before they could take another step toward me, Donovan Sterling raised his hand. It was a simple, subtle gesture, but it carried the absolute authority of a man who controlled the financial destinies of half the people in that room. The guards stopped dead in their tracks, looking highly confused. DeAndre heard his wife screaming and sprinted across the ballroom, shoving past a group of startled investors. He wrapped his arms tightly around Heather, pulling her into his chest while glaring violently in my direction. He looked like a man ready to commit murder, entirely prepared to play the heroic protective husband, defending his fragile family from the dangerous, unstable sister. "Zora." "I swear to God," DeAndre roared, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I told you what would happen if you ever came near my family again. Security, grab her right now and throw her out into the street. Call the police. She is violating a court order." But as DeAndre stepped forward to physically confront me, he finally noticed exactly who was standing next to me. His eyes widened. He looked at Donovan Sterling, the senior underwriter holding the key to his $2 million corporate lifeline. The rage on DeAndre's face instantly dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as his brain desperately tried to calculate how his estranged, supposedly bankrupt sister had walked into his elite gala on the arm of his primary investor. "Mr. Sterling." DeAndre stammered, his voice completely losing its aggressive edge. "I am so incredibly sorry about this disruption. This woman is my sister. She is deeply unwell. She has been harassing my wife and trying to extort our family company for months. She must have lied to you or tricked you into bringing her here. Please let my security team escort her out so we can discuss our business in peace." Donovan did not flinch. He looked at DeAndre with an expression of icy professional disdain. He did not say a single word, allowing the suffocating silence of the ballroom to magnify DeAndre's desperation. Aunt Vivian had been watching the entire scene unfold from her table near the front of the room. She saw DeAndre stumbling over his words. She saw the wealthy investors whispering and pointing. She realized that DeAndre was losing control of the narrative, and she decided to take matters into her own hands to permanently destroy my credibility. Aunt Vivian stood up from her chair, her face set in a look of grim maternal determination. She did not walk toward us. Instead, she marched directly up the steps of the main stage. She walked right past the stunned jazz musicians, grabbed the microphone from the brass stand, and tapped it sharply with her fingernail. A loud, piercing screech of audio feedback blasted through the ballroom speakers, causing several guests to cover their ears. Aunt Vivian held the microphone close to her mouth, looking out over the crowd of Chicago's elite, and then pointed directly at me. "Ladies and gentlemen," Aunt Vivian announced, her voice booming through the silent room with practiced theatrical sorrow. "I want to deeply apologize to all of you for this unfortunate disruption to such a beautiful evening of charity. Every family has a dark secret. Every family has a burden they must bear. And standing right there is ours." She paused, letting the dramatic weight of her words settle over the crowd. People were staring at me with a mixture of morbid curiosity and outright disgust. "That woman is my niece," Aunt Vivian continued, her voice dripping with venom, masquerading as grief. "Her name is Zora, and she is a delusional thief. She has spent her entire life intensely jealous of my son DeAndre and the incredible empire he has built. Just 2 days ago, we had to legally forcefully remove her from our family holding company because she was caught stealing from her own blood. And now, out of pure bitter spite, she has broken into this private event to terrorize a pregnant woman." Heather let out another perfectly timed echoing sob, burying her face deeper into DeAndre's shoulder. The investors around them murmured in sympathy, casting angry, judgmental glares in my direction. "Please do not listen to a single word she says," Aunt Vivian warned the crowd, gripping the microphone tightly. "She is a master manipulator. She is mentally unstable, and she will say absolutely anything to ruin the beautiful family DeAndre and Heather have created. She has no money, she has no standing, and she has no shame." Aunt Vivian lowered the microphone, looking down at me from the stage with a deeply satisfied, victorious glare. She truly believed she had just delivered the fatal blow. She thought she had effectively inoculated the entire room against anything I might say or do. By publicly branding me as a jealous, unstable thief, she had ensured that the wealthy elites would dismiss me as a crazy person the moment I opened my mouth. DeAndre regained his posture, a sickening smirk returning to his face. He believed his mother had just saved his entire financial future. He looked at Donovan, hoping the banker had been swayed by the emotional family drama. I stood completely still in the center of the ballroom. I felt the heavy collective judgment of hundreds of people pressing down on me. I listened to the whispers calling me unhinged. I watched my own family assassinate my character in front of the most powerful people in the city. It was a masterfully executed performance of psychological warfare. If I had been the woman they thought I was, I would have screamed. I would have defended myself. I would have desperately tried to yell over the crowd to prove my innocence, playing right into the angry, aggressive stereotype they had meticulously crafted for me. But I did not say a word. I did not need to. I simply looked past Aunt Vivian on the stage, shifting my gaze to the dark, elevated audio-visual control booth located at the very back of the ballroom. Standing inside the booth, hidden behind the tinted glass, was Julian. He was looking right at me, his hand resting on the master control console for the ballroom's digital projection system. I gave him a single subtle nod. My family had just demanded the undivided attention of every single investor in the room. They had forced everyone to stop eating, stop talking, and look directly at the stage. It was the absolute perfect setup. They had gathered their victims, demanded their attention, and dug their own graves as deep as they possibly could. Now it was time for me to bury them. The moment my chin dipped in that single, subtle nod, Julian went to work. From behind the tinted glass of the elevated control booth, he flipped the master override switch on the ballroom's audio-visual console. The transformation was instantaneous and violent. The soft, ambient golden uplighting that bathed the elegant room was completely killed, plunging the ballroom into a stark, dramatic darkness for 2 terrifying seconds. The jazz band's microphones let out a sharp, piercing squeal of audio feedback before going completely dead. The smooth melody of the saxophone abruptly stopped, replaced by the collective gasp of hundreds of wealthy guests. Up on the stage, Aunt Vivian tapped her microphone frantically, but it was completely useless. She stood in the dark, her victorious smile melting into deep confusion. Then the massive twin digital projection screens flanking the main stage roared to life. Instead of displaying the carefully curated, heartwarming slideshow of smiling children that Heather had prepared for her urban youth charity, the screens were flooded with high-definition, aggressively bright financial documents. The stark white background of the projection illuminated the entire ballroom, casting harsh shadows across the faces of Chicago's financial elite. I had not just brought a few bank statements, I brought a meticulously designed, undeniable visual execution. In the center of the massive screens was a bold, easy-to-read financial flow chart. The left side of the chart listed the exact names of the investors in the room, alongside the massive donations they had wired to Heather's charity over the past 6 months. Arrows pointed from those generous donations directly into the charity's primary banking account. But the money did not stop there. Bright red arrows tracked every single dollar as it was instantly routed out of the charity fund and funneled directly into a series of hidden shell corporations. The final destination of every single stolen dollar was displayed in massive, undeniable text at the bottom of the screen. The money was being poured directly into the corporate operating accounts of Trey's failing real estate brokerage. But I did not stop at the flowchart. Julian began cycling through the supporting evidence, letting each document stay on the screen just long enough for the wealthy crowd to read the details. He projected bank transfer logs showing funds being used to pay off DeAndre's massive private gambling debts. He displayed the receipt for the $50,000 deposit on the Drake Hotel ballroom, proving that Heather had used stolen charity money to fund the very party they were standing in. And finally, Julian projected the forged commercial lease agreement that Trey had signed for my penthouse, complete with the fake landlord signature and the fraudulent corporate stamp. The ballroom erupted. These were not gullible people. They were venture capitalists, real estate moguls, and senior bankers. They read balance sheets and financial audits for a living. It took them less than 30 seconds to analyze the data on the screens and realize exactly what was happening. The quiet, polite murmurs of high society vanished, replaced by an explosive wave of pure, unadulterated outrage. Men in expensive tuxedos pulled out their phones, frantically dialing their wealth managers and demanding immediate stop payment orders on the checks they had written that evening. Women in designer gowns pointed at the screens in horror, shouting at the hotel staff. They realized they had not been invited to a charity gala. They had been invited to a highly sophisticated robbery, and the criminals were standing right in front of them. Heather completely shattered. Her carefully constructed facade of the delicate, victimized pregnant woman dissolved into genuine frantic terror. She dropped her hands from her stomach and covered her mouth, her eyes wide as she stared at the undeniable proof of her federal crimes broadcast 30 feet high. The wealthy socialites she had spent months desperately trying to impress were now actively backing away from her, sneering in absolute disgust, as if she were a walking disease. Aunt Vivian stood frozen on the stage. She squinted at the massive screens, her brain struggling to process the complex financial data. But she did not need to understand the math to understand the fury of the crowd. She looked out at the angry faces of the investors, and then she frantically turned her head, searching the room for her son. But Trey was already gone. The absolute coward had taken one look at the wire fraud evidence bearing his company's name, dropped his expensive cocktail directly onto the carpet, and sprinted for the kitchen service doors. He abandoned his mother, his cousin, and his entire family to face the federal consequences alone. DeAndre was losing his mind. His chest heaved violently as he stared at the screens. He screamed at the ceiling, his voice cracking with panic, demanding that the hotel staff cut the power to the projectors. He lunged toward the back of the room, intending to break into the audio-visual booth, but he stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the heavy steel deadbolt Julian had locked from the inside. DeAndre realized his social and financial empire was burning to the ground in real time. He spun around, his eyes wild and desperate, searching for a single lifeline. He spotted Donovan Sterling standing calmly by my side in the center of the chaotic ballroom. DeAndre practically threw himself across the patterned carpet, shoving past two furious city council members to reach us. His tailored charcoal suit looked disheveled, sweat was pouring down his forehead. He reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab Donovan's arm, but the senior banker smoothly stepped back, refusing to let my brother touch him. "Donovan, listen to me," DeAndre pleaded, his voice a frantic, breathless whisper. "You have to listen to me. This is a setup. It is a massive cyber attack. My sister is a disgruntled, jealous hacker. She fabricated all of those documents to ruin my reputation because I fired her from the family company." Donovan simply stared at him, his expression completely unreadable. "You have my loan application." DeAndre continued, his words spilling out in a desperate rush. "You know my assets are completely rock solid. You saw the transfer paperwork. I am the sole owner of the grandfather's holding company. I have millions in collateral. Just ignore this stunt. Sign the $2 million loan authorization tonight, and I swear to you I will make sure your bank gets double the standard interest rate. Just please give me the money so I can fix this." I stood silently beside Donovan, watching my arrogant, cruel brother beg for his life. He was clinging to the holding company as his ultimate savior, entirely unaware that the company was the very anchor that was about to drag him to the bottom of the ocean. Donovan reached into his tailored jacket pocket. He did not pull out a pen. He did not pull out a checkbook. He pulled out his smartphone. He looked at the screen, then looked back up at DeAndre with a gaze so cold it could have frozen the entire room. Julian, watching from the booth, recognized the cue. He flipped a switch on his console. Suddenly, Donovan's voice echoed loudly and clearly through the ballroom's massive surround sound speakers. Julian had remotely activated the wireless lapel microphone Donovan was wearing, perfectly concealed under his silk tie. The booming sound of the banker's voice sliced through the screaming crowd. The ballroom instantly fell silent again, every single eye locking onto Donovan Sterling. "I did review your loan application, Mr. DeAndre," Donovan announced, his voice vibrating with absolute authority and professional disgust. "I reviewed the complete financial history of the holding company you so proudly took sole ownership of 2 days ago. I spent all afternoon looking at your grandfather's legacy." DeAndre forced a weak, trembling smile, nodding his head, as he desperately hoped for salvation. "Exactly," DeAndre whispered. "It is a fortress. It is a graveyard," Donovan corrected him, his voice echoing like thunder. "Your holding company does not possess a single liquid asset. What it does possess, and what you eagerly signed full personal liability for, is $8 million in toxic defaulted commercial real estate debt." DeAndre froze. The weak smile vanished. His jaw dropped slightly, his eyes darting back and forth as if his brain had suddenly short-circuited. He looked at me, then back at Donovan, unable to comprehend the words being spoken. "When you formally registered as the sole owner yesterday," Donovan continued relentlessly, "my bank received the automated federal notification. Since you assumed full uncontested liability for a company in catastrophic failure, the creditors immediately initiated asset seizure protocols. I received the final confirmation email from the Treasury exactly 1 hour ago." Heather let out a high, piercing wail, collapsing to her knees on the ballroom floor. She buried her face in her hands, her silver gown pooling around her as she realized her life of luxury was permanently over. "Your personal bank accounts are permanently frozen," Donovan declared, delivering the final crushing blow for the entire city to hear. "Your corporate assets are officially seized. Your $2 million loan application is entirely denied. Mr. DeAndre, you do not have a financial fortress. You have an $8 million anchor around your neck. As of 1 hour ago, you are completely irrevocably bankrupt. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel descended into absolute chaos as I walked out the heavy brass doors with Donovan Sterling by my side. Behind us, the screams of betrayed investors and the frantic shouting of my bankrupt brother echoed through the elegant corridors. We stepped out into the crisp Chicago night air, the cold wind whipping off the lake and settling over the city. Donovan offered me a polite nod of absolute respect before stepping into his waiting town car. I watched his vehicle pull away from the curb, knowing that the financial execution was complete. But my night was not over. You can strip an arrogant man of his wealth, his public standing, and his fabricated legacy, but a cornered rat is always at its most dangerous. DeAndre and Heather were entirely desperate. They knew the federal authorities would be knocking on their door by morning to investigate the massive wire fraud I had just publicly exposed. They knew the holding company was a sinking ship that was about to pull them to the bottom of the ocean. They needed to destroy the physical evidence tying them to the fake charity and the forged lease. And I knew exactly where they would go to find it. I dismissed my private driver and took a discreet cab straight back to my corporate office in the financial district. I rode the private elevator up to the 42nd floor, stepped into my dark suite, and dismissed the night security guard on duty. I walked into my private office, left all the lights off, and sat down in my high-backed leather executive chair. I swiveled around to face the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights twinkle below, and simply waited in the suffocating silence. It took them exactly 3 hours to hit absolute rock bottom. At 2 in the morning, the heavy frosted glass doors of my corporate suite rattled violently. I heard the sharp metallic click of the electronic deadbolt being forced open. Trey had somehow managed to steal a master keycard from the building management office during his frantic escape from the hotel, proving that even in his cowardice, he was still a highly functional criminal. Footsteps echoed heavily in the dark reception area. I heard the frantic, ragged breathing of 3 people moving quickly and clumsily through the space. They did not bother turning on the overhead lights, absolutely terrified of drawing attention from the street level or triggering the optical security sensors. I sat perfectly still in the deep shadows of my office, listening to the destruction begin. "Find the physical ledgers." DeAndre hissed, his voice echoing in the dark lobby, completely stripped of its usual confident bravado. "Trey, get into her financial officer's computer and wipe the hard drives." Heather grabbed the file boxes in the cabinets. "We have to destroy the audit trails before the feds get a warrant tomorrow morning. If we burn the source documents and shatter the drives, they cannot legally prove the charity money went into Trey's accounts." I listened to them tear through my pristine corporate suite like common thieves. The sound of heavy metal filing cabinets being yanked open and slammed shut vibrated through the floorboards. Thick paper folders were violently thrown onto the ground. I heard the frantic clicking of Trey desperately trying to bypass the military-grade encryption on Julian's desktop computer, followed by a loud crash as Trey simply pushed the monitor off the desk in a fit of panicked frustration. They were acting like feral animals, entirely stripping away the last remaining shreds of their wealthy, privileged facade. They were destroying property, breaking federal laws, and completely unraveling in the dark. The heavy wooden door to my private office was suddenly kicked open. The ambient moonlight from the city's skyline spilled across the carpet, illuminating 3 shadowy figures stepping into my workspace. Heather was breathing heavily, her hands full of random manila folders she had blindly grabbed from the reception desk. Her stunning silver maternity gown was torn at the hem, and her expensive updo had completely fallen apart. DeAndre stood beside her, his tailored suit jacket, discarded his silk tie, loosened his chest heaving as his eyes darted around the room searching for my personal safe. After 2 minutes of watching them frantically destroy my sanctuary, I calmly reached out and placed my hand on the edge of my mahogany desk. I slowly swiveled my leather chair around to face them. The sudden movement in the dark caused Trey to shriek like a terrified child. He dropped a stack of stolen hard drives onto the floor, the heavy metal components shattering against the hardwood. Heather froze completely, her eyes going wide with absolute horror as she realized the room was not empty. DeAndre whipped around his face, pale and slick with sweat, staring at me as I sat perfectly relaxed in the shadows. "What are you doing here?" DeAndre demanded, his voice shaking uncontrollably as he desperately tried to recover his aggressive, domineering posture. "I am sitting in my own office, DeAndre," I replied smoothly, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The better question is why my bankrupt brother, my fraudulent cousin, and my thieving sister-in-law are breaking into a private equity firm at 2 in the morning." The sound of my calm, steady voice caused Heather to completely snap. The sweet, delicate victim facade she had weaponized against me all week instantly vanished, replaced by sheer feral hatred. She dropped the stolen folders onto the floor, let out a guttural, terrifying scream, and violently lunged across the room toward my desk. She slammed her hands down onto the polished mahogany, knocking over my expensive desk lamp, leaning in so close I could smell the stale champagne and sheer panic on her breath. "You ruined my life!" Heather screamed, spit flying from her lips as her face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "You ruined my baby's future. You set us up. We are going to lose our home and our friends because you could not just let us be happy. You are a jealous, bitter monster." I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I looked her dead in the eye, watching her absolute collapse. "You ruined your own life, Heather," I said quietly. "You built an entire existence on stolen money, fake charity, and sheer entitlement. Now the foundation has collapsed, and you are looking for someone else to blame for your own greed." DeAndre stepped up beside his wife, grabbing her shoulder and physically pulling her back. But he did not do it to protect me. He did it so he could take her place. He stormed around the edge of my desk, his large frame blocking the moonlight from the window. He backed me into the corner, trapping my chair against the floor-to-ceiling glass. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. He raised his right fist in the air, his knuckles white, holding it inches from my face in a blatant attempt to physically intimidate me into submission. "I am going to end you, Zora," DeAndre threatened, his voice dropping to a low, vicious whisper. "I am going to beat you until you cannot speak, and then I am going to tell the police that I caught you breaking into your own company to steal money. You are going to log into your computer right now. You are going to sign a legally binding retraction stating that the audit you showed at the gala was entirely fabricated. You are going to give me my life back, or I swear to God you are not leaving this room." He was clinging to physical violence as his absolute last resort. He truly believed he could still bully his way out of a federal crime. He promised to destroy my career. He promised to hurt me. He stood there demanding complete compliance, utilizing the exact same tactics of fear and aggression he had used to control me since we were children. I looked at his raised fist. I looked at the sweat dripping down his face. And I finally let myself smile. It was not a bitter smile. It was a smile of pure, undeniable victory. "You are currently committing breaking and entering, corporate espionage, and attempting to physically extort a federal witness," I said, keeping my voice completely even. DeAndre sneered, his raised fist trembling slightly. "Federal witness. You are delusional, Zora. Nobody is going to believe you over me. I am the golden child. You are nothing." I did not respond to him. Instead, I reached under the lip of my desk and pressed a small concealed security button. The heavy automated blackout blinds covering the glass wall of the adjoining conference room instantly rolled up with a sharp mechanical whir. The surgical white LED lights in the conference room flickered on, flooding my dark office with blinding illumination. Standing on the other side of the soundproof glass, holding high-definition audio recording equipment and watching the entire physical assault unfold, were two heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Standing right next to them, holding a thick stack of federal warrants, was the United States prosecutor for the District of Chicago. The color completely drained from DeAndre's face. His raised fist slowly dropped to his side, his fingers uncurling as the absolute reality of his situation crashed down upon him. Heather let out a quiet, terrified whimper, her knees buckling as she collapsed onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably into the carpet. Trey bolted for the main office door, but he did not make it 2 steps before the heavy glass doors of my suite swung open, and 3 more federal agents rushed inside, their tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness. I stood up from my leather chair, smoothing out the fabric of my emerald evening gown. I stepped around my desk and walked slowly toward my brother, who was now backed up against the wall, his eyes wide with inescapable terror. "I did not just buy the penthouse, DeAndre," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "My private equity firm bought the parent company of the bank that held your business loans. I bought the commercial brokerage firm Trey works for. I own every single piece of financial earth you walk on. I control your debts, your leases, and your assets. And that fake lease you so proudly submitted to a judge to freeze my bank accounts, that was the final piece of physical evidence the prosecutor needed to prove your wire fraud syndicate." DeAndre stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. There were no more lies to spin. There were no more parents to hide behind. There was no more stolen money to shield him from the consequences of his own arrogance. The agent stepped into the room, pulling DeAndre's arms behind his back and snapping cold steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The golden child had finally met his match, and I watched in absolute silence as my empire stood tall over the ruins of his. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly, finalizing the end of DeAndre's reign. The 2 federal agents spun my brother around, pressing him firmly against the mahogany panels of my office wall, while they read him his Miranda rights. DeAndre did not fight back. The arrogant, dominating golden child had completely vacated his body, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man staring blankly at the floor. Out in the reception area, a brief scuffle broke out, followed by the sound of a heavy body hitting the floor. 2 more agents dragged Trey back into my private office. My slick, talking cousin was practically hyperventilating, his expensive suit jacket torn at the shoulder. The moment they forced him to his knees to cuff him, Trey immediately began babbling. He screamed that he was just an employee, that DeAndre was the mastermind, and that he was willing to testify to absolutely everything if the prosecutor gave him a plea deal. He was folding before he even made it into the back of a police cruiser. But the most spectacular betrayal of the night did not come from Trey. One of the female agents stepped toward Heather, who was still kneeling on my carpet, weeping into her hands. The agent placed a hand on Heather's shoulder and informed her that she was being detained as an accessory to federal wire fraud. The tears stopped instantly. Heather dropped her hands from her face, her eyes wide, entirely devoid of the fabricated sorrow she had weaponized just minutes before. Pure, unfiltered self-preservation took over. She scrambled backward, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at her husband. "I did not do anything!" Heather shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the bright room. "It was all him. He forced me to sign those charity documents. He told me it was a legitimate organization. I am a pregnant woman. I am a victim of his financial abuse. I want a lawyer right now, and I want full immunity because I will give you every single password to his private accounts." DeAndre slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The sheer devastation on his face was almost pitiable. The woman he had stolen for the woman he had committed federal crimes to impress had thrown him to the wolves the absolute second her own freedom was threatened. Their perfect, wealthy, untouchable marriage dissolved right there on my office floor. The lead prosecutor stepped forward, signaling the agents to pack it up. They hauled DeAndre and Trey to their feet. They did not look at me as they were marched out of my office, out of my building, and into the waiting armored vehicles on the street below. Heather was escorted out right behind them, loudly demanding to speak to the district attorney to secure her immunity deal. I stood in the center of my wrecked office, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the surrounding skyscrapers. The long, exhausting war was finally over. Early the next morning, I was sitting in the brightly lit lobby of the downtown federal precinct. I had spent the past 3 hours giving my official witness statement to the lead prosecutor and handing over the final pieces of forensic accounting Julian had compiled. I was zipping up my leather briefcase, preparing to head home and finally get some sleep, when the heavy glass doors of the precinct lobby violently swung open. Aunt Vivian rushed inside looking completely unrecognizable. Her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. She was wearing an oversized trench coat hastily thrown over her pajamas. Her eyes were bloodshot and swollen from crying all night. She frantically scanned the crowded room until her eyes locked onto me sitting on a wooden bench near the elevators. She did not march over with her usual toxic authority. She practically stumbled toward me, her hands shaking as she clutched a crumpled tissue. She threw herself onto the bench beside me, her voice a desperate rasping whisper, "Zora, please!" Aunt Vivian begged, tears streaming down her aged face. "I have been calling everyone." The judge set their bail at $2 million each because they are flight risks. The bondsman wants 10% in cash, but the feds froze all of Trey's accounts. They froze everything. DeAndre's lawyer will not even return my calls because his retainer bounced. They are going to transfer them to the federal penitentiary by noon. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on my briefcase. I looked at the woman who had publicly denounced me at a gala just 12 hours ago, calling me a delusional thief and a monster. "You have to pay it, Zora," Aunt Vivian pleaded, reaching out to grab my arm. I smoothly pulled my arm away before she could make contact. "You are the only one with the money. You own the bank, you own the companies. You have to write the check and get your brother and your cousin out of those cells. We can fix this. We can sit down as a family and sort out the money. But you cannot let your own blood rot in federal prison. You have to do this for the sake of family." The sheer audacity of her request was breathtaking. She had spent my entire life treating me like dirt beneath her shoes. She had gleefully participated in my public destruction. But the moment the golden child faced actual consequences, she expected me to sacrifice my own wealth to save him simply because we shared a bloodline. I stood up from the wooden bench looking down at my Aunt Vivian. I felt absolutely no anger, no resentment, and no pity. I just felt completely indifferent to her existence. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone, pretending to check a message. Then I looked her dead in the eye, maintaining a perfectly polite, entirely cold expression. "I am sorry," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet precinct lobby. "I do not know who let you in here." Aunt Vivian froze, her jaw dropping slightly as she stared up at me, the realization of what was happening slowly washing over her face. I turned my head and locked eyes with the armed precinct security guard standing near the metal detectors. I gestured toward the weeping, disheveled woman sitting on the bench. "Who let her in?" I asked loudly, repeating the exact words my cousin Trey had used to humiliate me in my own home just days before. "She is like mold, keeps coming back. Security, clear her out. Every last one of them." The guard, recognizing me as the federal prosecutor's key witness, immediately walked over. He placed a firm hand on Aunt Vivian's shoulder, instructing her that she was causing a disturbance and needed to wait outside. She tried to scream my name, tried to beg one last time, but the guard physically guided her toward the revolving doors. I turned my back, walked out the side exit toward my waiting car, and left her behind forever. 6 months later, a warm summer breeze swept across the sprawling terrace of my downtown Chicago penthouse. I stood near the glass railing, a crystal flute of vintage champagne in my hand, looking out over the glittering expanse of the city skyline. The deep, heavy burden I had carried in my chest since I was 18 years old was completely gone. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute peace of my sanctuary. Behind me, the floor-to-ceiling glass doors were slid wide open, letting the sounds of my dinner party drift out into the night air. There was no chaotic DJ, no cheap catering, and absolutely no underlying tension. Instead, a string quartet played softly in the corner of my living room. My private chef was serving a beautiful multi-course meal on the same imported marble island where my family had once carelessly tossed their greasy appetizer trays. I turned around and leaned against the railing, watching the people gathered in my home. This was my true family. I saw Julian, my brilliant chief financial officer, laughing genuinely as he shared a story with Chloe, the brave receptionist who had stood her ground the day DeAndre barged into our corporate suite. I saw Donovan Sterling, my closest mentor, offering quiet, invaluable investment advice to a group of my younger analysts. There were no veiled insults being traded across the room. There were no manipulative performances, no unrealistic demands, and absolutely no one trying to tear someone else down to make themselves feel taller. It was a room built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, earned trust, and unwavering loyalty. The contrast between tonight and the nightmare of Heather's baby shower was profound. In the 6 months since the charity gala, the fabricated empire my brother and his wife had built completely disintegrated into dust. Faced with a mountain of undeniable physical and digital evidence, DeAndre and Trey had no choice but to accept plea deals. They both pleaded guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy. They were currently serving out their lengthy sentences in a federal correctional facility in a neighboring state. DeAndre, the undisputed golden child, who had spent his entire life failing upward, finally hit a wall that our parents could not buy him out of. Heather's desperate attempt to secure an immunity deal by turning on her husband had only partially saved her. She avoided a prison sentence, but she did not avoid the absolute destruction of her social standing. The federal government seized every single asset purchased with the stolen charity funds. Stripped of her stolen wealth and drowning in exorbitant legal fees, she was forced to move back into her parents' suburban basement. She was completely permanently ostracized from the elite high society circles she had ruthlessly sacrificed everything to join. Her days of hosting extravagant galas and posting viral smear campaigns were over. As for Aunt Vivian, she found herself completely alone. The toxic matriarch who had spent decades pitting her family members against one another suddenly had no one left to manipulate. She lives in a downsized apartment on the outskirts of the city, spending her days bitterly complaining to anyone who will listen about how her ungrateful wealthy niece destroyed the family. But her audience has vanished. The community knows exactly what she enabled, and they want absolutely nothing to do with her. Standing on my balcony watching my chosen family celebrate together, I realized something incredibly important about the nature of generational curses. For so many years, my family had weaponized the concept of loyalty against me. They conditioned me to believe that because I was a strong Black woman, I was inherently obligated to absorb their mistakes, fund their failures, and silently endure their disrespect. They demanded that I set myself on fire simply to keep the golden child warm. They wanted me to carry the emotional and financial debts of my brother, ensuring that the cycle of dysfunction would continue forever. But I chose a different path. I realized that building actual generational wealth is not just about acquiring holding companies, securing corporate loans, or buying luxury real estate. True wealth is about fiercely protecting your peace. It is about having the courage to ruthlessly cut away the toxic rot, even when that rot shares your DNA, so the healthy parts of your life can finally grow and flourish. I had to let my family's hollow, fraudulent empire burn to the ground so I could protect the legitimate empire I had built with my own two hands. I learned the hardest lesson of all. Blood might determine who you are related to by birth, but it is your boundaries, your self-respect, and your shared values that determine who you are actually family with. I took a final sip of my champagne, feeling a profound and unshakable sense of victory. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the bitter, isolated sister they desperately tried to paint me as. I was the architect of my own destiny, surrounded by people who loved me for my mind, my integrity, and my resilience. I turned around and walked back inside my beautiful, peaceful home to join the people who actually deserved a seat at my table. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family to protect your peace and your empire? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, never let anyone make you feel small in a room you paid for. Like and subscribe for more.